All right, I'm on? Okay, cool. So I do have some slides I'll go through, but I'm also right before lunch, so I'm the last thing keeping you from lunch, so I figured I would, put some things in here to make you hungry a little bit. So I'll start by saying, first time I got off an airplane in Heathrow, I was kind of confused when the taxi driver offered to put my luggage into the boot. That doesn't really mean the same thing in the US. Further confused when I ordered chips and actually got something that looked much more like Flamsefritz. I might get myself into trouble a little bit here, but I lived in Germany for a few years. I always find it interesting to come to the Netherlands and find I can actually read a lot of the signs. I want a sandwich, I go to the Bäckerei, I get some Brot with cheese. I can always find the exit. So what are some of the things that are in common about the things I just talked about? Well, really, it's the same concepts really expressed in different languages, but all these languages have some common roots. So there are a lot of things in common between the languages. They use the same alphabet generally. There's a couple little weird variations like the IJ thing. I don't know where that came from, but they're using similar words to express the same concepts. We're not here to talk about common languages, we're here to talk about FHIR. So we built an application for a Cerner app challenge. It was called Cardiac Consultant. It is intended to load patient data from an EHR and then just allow a doctor to demonstrate how their risk factors for cardiovascular disease change over time based on that data. So a patient's visiting with a doctor. The doctor launches up the app, pulls it up, and the first thing it does is load up a whole bunch of data from the EHR and then go through and identify all these things. It says, well, we couldn't figure out this or this or this, so that the doctor knows. And then at that point, it launches the app. There are a whole bunch of filters over on the side that are all the generated data from the EHR that it was able to calculate in. So I'm not going through it. This is a very quick demo of this app. We have the full demo online. But the point here really is the filters over on the left side come from the EHR directly, and we're doing a whole bunch of calculation to actually make that happen. Also, certain things have default values where we can't actually figure out what the value was supposed to be from the EHR. Either the data's not there or we can't compute it in some way. We decided to set those basically to 0 things within the model so that they don't have any impact. But then we're also warning the doctor that that's actually a default and they might want to go fix that and actually put the real data in. You can also restore it back to whatever we loaded from the EHR. And that allows the doctor to then go and make changes in the model and then see how the changes are impacted over on the right side, and then talk to the patients about that. So how do we actually get this data from the EHR to pull into our thing? Well, some things are pretty easy. So patient records, we just pull up the patient record. We can get things like age, sex, name. The age we have to calculate for the birthday, but that's all pretty straightforward. We can pull observations, and we can get weight, height, blood cholesterol, or blood pressure. Once we start getting into things with conditions and medications and encounters, things get a little tricky. There are a lot of different codes that we have to look at. So for example, is the patient a smoker or not? There are 20 different codes we can look at. There's, they are a smoker, they're not a smoker. This comes from the doctor's interview with the patient, so it's not necessarily properly coded. Let's look at the case of, is this patient being treated for diabetes? Well, to know that, we have to know, do they have diabetes? There are 500 possible terminology codes that represent diabetes across ICD-9, ICD-10, SNOMED that we were looking at. This was tied to Cerner specifically, so those were, even within Cerner, we got 3 different coding sets depending on what patient we were looking at. We then have to know, is the patient taking medication that can be used to treat diabetes, like metformin, for example? Well, turns out metformin can also be used to treat other diseases that might be related to blood sugar but are not diabetes. So how do you actually put these things together to figure out the answer to this question? You have to go through a whole bunch of logic and then some calculations and come up with, how confident are you in this actual value that you've calculated. So Cerner also had some other interesting challenges, like they don't, at least in the sandbox, have family member history resources. They do, however, code those resources as conditions with a special set of terminologies. So we can go in and find this data, but not in the place we would have necessarily expected it to be. We also discovered as part of the process that, at least in Cerner's implementation, their condition resource does not allow you to query based on codes. It should. The spec says that that's one of the search parameters, and they didn't implement it. So that means to actually do the query to figure out, does this patient have a particular condition, we have to get all the conditions back in the client, iterate through them, and look for codes until we find the ones that match. We can batch that up so we can look for a whole bunch of codes at once, but that's not obvious given what the FHIR spec should actually have in it. We had to figure this all out as we were going and building out each individual filter. So this works for Cerner. We presented at the Cerner conference. A whole bunch of other EHRs are actually now interested in getting our app into their app stores. And this is actually kind of a problem because it's really not a plug-and-play solution. We would like it to be. We'd like to say, hey, we have this app, it works everywhere, but well, for one, it's using DSTU2 because that's what Cerner has. So that supports Epic, that doesn't necessarily support other EHRs that are on 3 already. So we currently are in an environment where you basically have point-to-point integrations. You have a client, you have a server, everyone's building apps for specific servers. You know, there are other apps out there, other servers out there. How do we actually make this scalable? We want to be able to plug anything to anything else. That's really the promise of FHIR. We're not really at that point yet. There are some challenges. To bring back the language thing at the beginning for a moment, we think about FHIR as being a common language that everyone is able to speak. FHIR is great. It's this common language. We're all speaking it. What if it were actually more like a common alphabet, and profiles are actually the common language? So that's, I'll put that out there to think about. There are some things where you can have a version 3 patient that works with multiple profiles. That's great. That's sort of like the word bakarai. You can understand it in lots of different languages. So the profiles are actually the thing that define the common use cases, the common schemas, extensions that are being used. They might constrain your terminology set so that you can say, okay, I know I'm only looking at SNOMED for this thing, so that means that these 20 codes are relevant, these other 500 are not relevant in my case. That definitely helps. Servers are actually not required to implement everything that's in the profile, though, either. Like the case of the conditions not being searchable by code. That was not an obvious thing. The spec said, or the profile Cerner implement said, you should be able to do this, but they didn't implement it, and that's fine. It's not a requirement of implementing the profile. So there's still a lot of workarounds here and nuance. So if you have an app and you're trying to integrate it into a new server, you have to ask a whole bunch of fundamental questions to figure out, is this even going to work, or how much effort is going to be required to do this? So does it even support the same FHIR version? If I've implemented for 2, can I support 3? Or can I support 4? Can I support 5 coming up, right? Do they support the same implementation guide and profiles? If not, are there some easy conversions between them? Does the EHR you're connecting with actually have the same features that you need for your app? Does it have the data that you need to actually be able to power your app? And if it's not where you expect, where is that data? Is there some other way to get to it? And then does it support terminologies you already know what to do with? If they throw in RxMed and you don't know, or RxNorm, and you don't know how to deal with that, you have to add that logic to your app to make it work. So all this ends up making your app really heavy. Every system you connect to, you have to add new edge cases and new code if you want your app to if you want a single code base to actually be able to talk to multiple EHRs. You also could fork your app and then have multiple code bases, one for each EHR, and that means the app itself is lighter, but you then have to maintain multiple versions. Maybe you make a UI change in one and you need to go back and make that change in the other. So there's a lot of complexity that's introduced. It would be nice if we could remove some of these barriers. So there are some things that your app can do now to sort of help with this. I won't say I have the answer to how to make interoperability work, but I have some suggestions that if you're building apps that you want to be in this environment, you should think about. So definitely read the capability statement of whatever server you're reading, or you're connecting to. Have your app read it. You should also personally read it and make sure that you actually understand what capabilities are in there and what's not. But when the app starts up, it should read that capability statement. It should be able to configure itself under one of several different, to use one of several different mechanisms to actually get to any particular data, and be able to do those translations and understand the nuances of that particular server. And then you'll probably need some switch statement in there that actually is able to code around whatever that server has. This should, if you've put all the code in place, you should actually be able to do this automatically when the app launches, based strictly on the capability statement. That's the cool part about the spec, is that it's all codable, or computable is the way that Graham calls it, so that you can figure these things out in your app. Version discovery is actually a pretty cool feature. It was introduced in R4. Graham has had some talks about it this week that have been great. I'm pretty excited about this. It allows your app basically to discover what FHIR versions are available on a particular server. It does not really extend yet to the concept of profiles, but your capability statement itself says what profile it supports. But this lets you have a single server that has multiple versions of FHIR. So it may be that in the future, Cerner supports both 3 and 4 and 2, and then my app can choose which one it would like to use at that given endpoint. Here's a quick overview of how it works. You basically ask the server for what versions it has. It gives you back some numbers based on the versions. It also has a default, and if it does not respond to this endpoint at all, you assume you just go get the capability statement, and it'll just be whatever version it is. And you have to deal with that, or you don't connect to the server if you don't like it. But if it gives you back these versions, you can then use the version, and then when you're making the request to get the capability statement, you tell it which version you want. And then it will give you back the capability statement with that same version, and then you can use that MIME type over time to keep getting resources. That's definitely very helpful. It only works right now if all of the versions are at the same base URL, because you basically go to the base URL and you say what versions are available. There's no way to have endpoints. I've been working with Graham actually on an extension that will allow you to specify where other endpoints might be that are related to your server. To me, that seems like a pretty useful use case. There are reasons why you might want them all on one base. There are reasons you might want them on separate bases. So that will hopefully be out soon. There's a Zulip thread about that if you're interested, called multiple FHIR versions in the implementers channel. Go look it up if you have use cases you want to weigh in on that. So another option is actually try to offload a lot of the logic off of your app and put it somewhere else. So one of the recommendations that we have is to use a FHIR server actually as middleware, basically. Connect another FHIR server behind it. We recommend ours, but really any of them will work. Ours is JavaScript, and you basically write all your own adapters. It's just a sort of thin FHIR layer that you can put other things behind. And that's convenient because maybe the middleware server can use the same OAuth tokens that the underlying server uses. The app could go directly to the EHR for some things, and it could go to the middleware server for other things. You could also use the middleware server to do calculations, actually, and you use things like the measure resources, so that I could maybe ask a question like, does this patient have diabetes? And sort of overload the whole clinical quality measure system that's in FHIR and just kind of give a real result, say yes or no. We haven't implemented that yet, but that's something that we've been thinking about, like what would it take to do this? But the advantage of that is it offloads a lot of that logic and capability off onto the server so that your app can be lightweight and somebody can download it quickly. You also could potentially use a middleware server to do things that EHR doesn't support, like save certain kinds of resources. Perhaps you save them somewhere else and then feed them back in some back-end process. So this is a little bit about our server. This is not a sales pitch, but there are some cool things in there. It's all auto-generated code based on structure definitions. And check out our website. We have a full demo of that cardiac consultant app, code to get to the FHIR server. The song that was played Wednesday night is up there. You can go find it. So thanks. And I think we have plenty of time for questions, probably. Anyone have anything? I saw a lot of nods in the room. What have people in the room encountered these kind of use cases? No one wants to say anything. That's fine. Yes.
Well, what you're describing seems to be very classical integration problems and challenges, and the technical interoperability is always easier than the semantic interoperability. Yeah.
That is true. That is true. I mean, one of the things that the FHIR spec is very deliberately trying to do is not reinvent wheels. Use best practices where they exist. But that also means that FHIR has the same challenges every other integration tool has. I'm hopeful that after R4, things might become a little bit easier and that there won't be breaking changes between versions moving forward. But we're probably not realistically going to have everyone up to R4 for like 3 to 5 years. So, and even after that, the spec's going to keep changing, and there will be a lot of resources that are not yet normative, which will still have breaking changes. So this problem's going to persist for a long time. I'm also actually kind of excited about the stuff that FHIR Lee's been doing with package versioning. I think that's pretty cool. We haven't done a lot with that ourselves yet with the things we've been dealing with, but I think that also might go part of the way to solving some of these things if you at least can agree on what those package versions are. But it's, again, that's still at a lower level than just FHIR is just interoperable everywhere.
That's probably also the initial talk I wanted to hear how, if I use your FHIR server for integration purposes, how does it synchronize with the EHR?
So we leave that up to the implementer, but I mean, what our server actually is a framework for building a FHIR facade. We have a version of it that actually has some implementation already built out with the Mongo backend database, which you can use. You can put your data into Mongo and you can feed it up that way. So it can be a standalone server. We actually are working with the Microsoft team to be able to launch it in Azure pretty quickly like that. But we think a lot of the value of our server compared to maybe some of the other ones out there is that you can wrap it around your own data and you can basically build the resource adapters. So I don't have enough slides about this right now, but you can say, I want to expose patient and observation and encounter and medication request, and then it will build the capability statement for you that has all those things in it. You implement some classes that say, okay, I've got this thing, here are all the parameters that were requested, go out to my database, do whatever query I need to do, grab the data, give it back, and then we sort of do all the validation and security and make sure that things are compliant with whatever capability statement we're producing sort of around a version. And we have abilities to compile the code basically around any FHIR version, any implementation guide, so that you can sort of be compliant to whatever that is. That was the approach that we took. There are also a lot of other great servers out there that work in plenty of different ways.
Okay, so I have to build some for a specific integration case, right?
Right. It is open source. We have a actually pretty active development community around it right now, sort of building out various use cases and sometimes contributing data adapters back or various things. We intend to continue to make it more robust and then have a sort of fully standalone version that implements all of the features that you'd need. We have a long roadmap. It's a lot of work, but yeah. But so I mean, our main thing was about people who have a development team who wants to go and build the integrations, but doesn't want to have to learn necessarily all of FHIR or deal with all the different security things you have to deal with. Any questions? Yes.
Does it still remain an EMR among the biggest one, which does not support FHIR for the interoperability, for your experience?
So my experience is from the US, where law, right. So in the US market, there's been law in place for 5 or 10 years. It's basically said that everyone has to start supporting, so 10 years ago it was everyone has to start having digital clinical records. So that transition's basically already happened. Some new phases have started to kick in recently where interoperability is actually one of the targets. And so everyone, from our experience, has been putting in FHIR in some capacity. Often it's a regulatory requirement. They want to be able to check the box and say, okay, I've got FHIR, great. That doesn't mean they're actually doing it well. Our experience has mostly been with Cerner for this particular thing, and our main client is a Cerner shop. I also know that Epic actually uses the same back-end database by InterSystems, the MUMPS database, and that's actually where a lot of the FHIR functionality is actually being built. So the Cerner folks have told us that they're not going to have support for FHIR version 3 until InterSystems builds support for FHIR version 3, which is maybe next year sometime. At which point 4 will already be normative, but they're going to be building 3, and then it'll take them a year or two to actually roll that out, and then they'll be building out 4 once 5 becomes normative, essentially. So we're not expecting rapid progress on that, but it does seem that at least all the EHRs that we've talked to are moving in that direction. And EHRs that are sort of perhaps more modern and aren't using the MUMPS database are already on 3. So one of the ones who came and talked to us is on 3 already. And I'm not sure what things are like in other countries. Hopefully everyone's moving to FHIR, but that's why we're all here.
We don't have new EHRs at that level.
Yeah. Actually, U.S. policy has actually been surprisingly forward-leaning on interoperability stuff. A lot of the reason that Asymmetric got involved in FHIR in the first place has actually been through incentives from U.S. government on various things, which has been great. And that's not always the case, but in this particular area, it's actually been pretty helpful. And I think U.S. is ahead of a lot of other countries in sort of pushing this forward. All right, yes.
You already said that profiles could help in interoperability, right?
Mm-hmm.
Profiles can also be a lot. You can create very open profiles.
Mm-hmm.
You can create very restricted profiles. Do you have a saying there? Do restrictive profiles help more, or?
I don't have an opinion on that at this point. I think that the more rigorous you can be with how you're defining things, in some ways the easier it is to implement around. You don't have to be sort of so open-ended of handle like lots of different cases. But if the profile's too restrictive, then people who are actually producing data will find ways to work around that, perhaps, and put data in places that they shouldn't really be putting it because you haven't defined your profile properly. We haven't really encountered, like I don't have an opinion on that from personal experience at this point, but I'm happy to talk to people more about it. All right, yes.
Do you have any idea how, for example, IHG targets that problem to define some integration profiles and provide a better interoperability guideline?
I don't know specifically what IHE is doing around that. I know that all of the EHRs in the US are following basically US core in some version, but US core is not, and the Argonaut project, but that's not super specific in a lot of these things. So there's still a lot of variability even between what Epic does and what Cerner does. I'm not sure what the IHEs are doing, honestly.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, IHG was an organization that tried to build some meta standard around HL7, V2, and also DICOM to describe migration scenarios and define, okay, what's the actors and what's also transactions in this migration scenario to overcome exactly these problems. Even if you have some kind of standard, you have different implementations. So
Right.
unfortunately, I also have no idea what the progress is there and how they
Right.
Or would be, but you have no idea.
I don't know. Sorry. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it seems like if groups are able to come together around, like, this is the profile that we are all going to support. I mean, that's really the point of profiles. If people are able to actually come together around that and you're able to build an app for a specific profile, you should be able to use it the same way everywhere. That's the point, right? You just need your profiles to be constructed carefully and actually be, to have enough required elements that there's not a lot of, this variability within a profile. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, well, and ultimately, perhaps that is the solution, right? Is build your app against a profile, or perhaps, a version 2 profile and a version 3 profile. But say, I'm only going to support things that have this. If your EHR does not implement this profile, then sorry, you're out of luck. All right, cool, thank you. Feel free to come talk to us afterward. We're hanging out at the table that's right behind the registration booth, where there's a big sign that says security on it. That's my other thing. So, cool, thanks.